Hi folks, Florida Man here. This is the GM perspective on Talleyrand. I will keep this relatively brief because in bits and pieces you've been getting my perspective about many things throughout these videos. I will give my attempts at constructive feedback about things people did wrong in my view, and I will praise the areas where I believe different players were strong. I'll go player by player instead of year by year to better highlight that this is about feedback on the play rather than just rehashing the game and the moves that have been discussed endlessly in all of the other videos. England. Early on, England and France bounced in the Channel, which was not actually arranged, but was a surprise to both of them. I mention this because England then pretended to Germany that the bounce was arranged, which I suspect may have eroded a little bit Germany's trust toward England. All of this was essentially England getting off to a rough start in the game. England needs one of his neighbors to be an ally, and here neither of them ended up being friendly. England should have worked hard to convince Germany to work with him here, and after examining the press, I don't think over these first couple of years that he was selling it very hard. At the same time, tactically, I would say England simultaneously chose to essentially turn his back all the way on France and arguably pick a fight with Russia by convoying an army into Norway. I think that move was a mistake for both of those reasons, and because England's diplomatic positioning was already weak, that mistake was almost immediately fatal. I think the English player did a good job of being likable in messages with the other players, but the volume of press was not as much as I would expect, and although he tried consistently to find ways to work with his neighbors, I feel as if he needed both to play more defensively once it was clear France was probably an enemy, and also to work harder to convince one of his neighbors to work with him. However, to a certain degree I will say the situation was out of his hands, and we didn't get to see his full talents, because when your two neighbors decide to work together right off the bat, it's frequently pretty hard to turn things around from there. It's hard to break people up in the beginning of the game. Austria. Early on, Austria decided to move to Venice for no good reason, and no one expected that or asked for it. It also held very little prospect of gain, so it was just an all-around bad move, and it produced the outcome of causing every Austrian neighbor to seek Austria's death. The player then tried gunboating for part of the game, and at one point ordered all of his units into the Black Sea. He also ignored opportunities to work with Turkey, and didn't seem to try very hard to work with Russia or Germany. So while Austria did end up managing to work with France briefly, I feel as if he really did the least he could have done with his position. Given that Austria is actually a good player in in-person games, the feedback I almost want to give would be something like, take the games you sign up for more seriously, really try to win, even if you get a position you don't like. Since the Austrian player was charming and personable, I feel as if he could have done much better if he didn't make multiple self-destructive decisions, and most importantly, if he didn't try to gunboat this. I think he could have turned the early game around, but he just did not want it enough. Germany. The German early game was just fine in the sense that he didn't make many obvious mistakes, but Germany also essentially didn't do anything in the Western Triangle for the first 2 game years. He shouldn't have gone east to fight Austria, because Vienna was not a center he was ever going to be able to hold, and that army could have been useful fighting France. On the subject of France, I think him siding with France when France was making so much immediate progress against England was, in retrospect, an obvious mistake. Germany should have made sure, at least in the negotiation stage, that he was given Belgium, because France was making so much immediate progress against England. Also, given that Austria fell so quickly, and Italy became relatively strong so quickly, Germany should have pushed very hard for a joint attack on France by himself, Italy, and Russia moving in through the English centers by sea, before England was even fully defeated. Even if Italy wasn't willing to lead the charge there, Germany should have been willing to take the lead himself and try to get Italy to promise to join him if Germany started the fight against France. France's positioning in this early to mid-game period made clear that Germany was going to be under threat by France, and in that situation it's better to take the fight to your opponent rather than wait to be attacked. I think Germany was clearly a player who was good at forging alliances and winning friends, but he didn't think as strategically as he needed to about the different positions each player was in. instead of seeing the board clearly and moving based on how things were actually going, he moved to some degree based on how he hoped things would go. If Germany can fix that, he was clearly one of the stronger players on this board. I think if he were in a different position, he would have done better. Russia. Frankly, Russia is the easiest player to criticize here. He was newer, so he made some rather basic mistakes. He started wars with both Turkey and Austria early on, and he never gained from either of those because his forces were spread too thin, and he never actually secured support from his allies into any Austrian or Turkish center. He left himself open to a German attack in the mid-game, and he failed to see the necessity of building a fleet in St. Pete's north coast to fight France after France turned on Germany. These were all significant mistakes. At the same time, Russia's instinct, which was to be worried about Italian betrayal by the time Italy asked him to build a fleet in St. Pete, were correct. Italy immediately stabbed Russia after Russia failed to build that fleet, and Italy was working against Russia before that, helping Turkey to move in ways that would allow him to effectively defend against the Russian advance. Specifically, Italy was leaking moves to Turkey. And, although I'm not sure Russia could tell that, Russia could tell that Italy was hostile. He could also tell when Germany was about to stab him. Really, Russia's instincts and intuition were fairly good in this game. He also correctly assessed that he could turn his back on France when Italy stabbed him and just focus on defending against Italy, and France would either leave him alone or help him. And that proved to be correct as well. Some of Russia's good decisions are obscured by the fact that he was not very tactically skilled, due to the aforementioned inexperience, but that doesn't mean he was wrong about all or even most of what he did. I think he had a good read on the people in the game. His inexperience caused him to violate some of the norms that many diplomacy players will bring to a game. He threw a solo to France when he might have shared in the draw, although it's worth noting that there was no guarantee of him sharing in the draw, and Italy and Turkey were moving in ways that looked intended to eliminate him until almost the last minute. He also forwarded all of his press with Italy to everyone. The latter does seem bad by most player standards, including mine, although it doesn't violate any rules. It mostly seems bad because it was not helpful to him. However, most of my feedback to Russia boils down to this. He needs to get more experience with diplomacy. I don't think he should quit the game, and I don't think Italy was correct that Russia was trying to stab Italy when Italy stabbed Russia. I think Russia needs to get more experience, and with more experience, a lot of these mistakes will actually disappear, and he'll be quite a good player, eventually. Italy. Speaking of Italy, Italy was clearly one of the strongest players in this game. His early game was very strong, probably stronger than anyone else's except perhaps France's. He balanced good diplomatic play with strong tactical play, and an eye on the big picture of the map. He conquered all of Austria and made all of the gains there, and he also stabbed Russia very effectively in the mid-game, and coordinated a strong anti-French stand in the later game, that, by all rights, should have resulted in him making it into a draw. However, I think Italy made several pretty serious mistakes as well. Italy waited too long to do anything about France, which is how France became a solo threat. Italy did very little to help Germany survive, and indeed deserted Tyrolia at a critical point when Italy could have helped Germany survive. This was important because Germany should have been a shield for Italy and delayed French success indefinitely. Instead of working to help Germany, Italy spent too long maintaining a good relationship with France, moving fleets back and forth in the Mediterranean, seemingly uncertain of where to send them, losing momentum as he did so. When Russia failed to build the fleet in St. Pete in this game, I think that was partly Italy's fault. Italy did not make a strong argument for the fleet, and a clear argument was especially necessary because Italy should have known by this point that Russia was a newer player. Also, I think part of the disagreement between Italy and Russia was because Russia gained almost nothing from working with Italy. Part of that is on Russia for dividing his forces and not fighting as effectively as he could have, and part of that's on Italy. When you're an ally, helping make sure your partner gains ground that he can hold on to is part of being a good ally. On a similar note, I think Italy stabbing Russia and resurrecting Turkey was one of the biggest strategic mistakes anyone made in this game. It left Italy between a strong France and a growing, resuscitated Turkey, and it was clear from Italy's moves that he spent considerable effort after this, defending against the possibility of a stab from the resurrected Turkey. This could easily have been avoided by continuing to work with Russia, and Italy essentially chose to turn on Russia because he found Russia difficult to negotiate with, and he didn't want to give Russia any of the centers that had been gained from defeating Austria. While I understand not wanting to continue working with Russia here, I think this was a strategic mistake. It started a new war and created a new threat at the same time that France was becoming increasingly significant as a threat. If Italy hadn't done this, or had been able to make up with Russia at some point, instead of it becoming quite personal for both of them, I think it's very unlikely that France would have won. Italy is clearly a very strong player, but in this particular game, I think he was too keen to see a stab coming where it was not, and too willing to assist an enemy and turn on an ally, because on the personal level, that ally seemed more difficult to deal with. Turkey. In my view, most of Turkey's mistakes are in the early game. In this case, moving to Armenia was a mistake, because it made Russia hostile, and then trying to make up with Russia was a mistake, because Austria had become genuinely interested in working together, and Russia was unforgiving. These are easy mistakes to make, though, before you've got a good read on all the players, and Turkey had the virtue of maintaining a fairly long view on the game as a whole, and seeing the French threat as a threat before anyone else. Although Turkey had this strategic vision, he did not figure out how best to deal with that threat. The best way for Turkey to deal with French strength in this game, once he was resurrected, was to take as much heat off of Italy as he could, and fight Russia as hard as possible, to try and take the Russian home centers before France got east. Instead, I would say that at times Turkey actively got in Italy's way, by moving in ways that were threatening to Italy rather than Russia. In candid moments, Turkey admitted that he did not want Italy to be too successful against France, because then Italy could become a solo threat himself. I think this reflects both a very inflated understanding of Italy's chances against France, and that Turkey underestimated France for much of the game, even as he was sounding the alarm against France. If Turkey hadn't been distracting Italian forces with completely unnecessary and provocative moves in the eastern Mediterranean region and the Balkans, I think France probably would have ended up in a 3-power draw with Italy and Turkey probably would have gotten into the draw and captured Moscow. All of which is to say that Turkey, while a pretty good strategist and a decent manipulator of the other players, needed to be a better team player once he was in a stop-the-solo alliance, and he should have probably considered Italy to be his ally as soon as Italy saved him from destruction. Saving Turkey was a big, dramatic step by Italy, not something I would have done, and Turkey should have taken that as a quite dramatic display of intent to work with him. But the interviews show that Turkey viewed Italy with a much greater degree of distrust than I think made sense. Turkey continued being worried about being eliminated, at a time when Italy eliminating him was essentially, for all intents and purposes, just plain impossible. France. Overall, France played the most solid game of any player here, I think, and the proof is really in the pudding there. He soloed. Victory speaks for itself. Turkey believes France moved too slowly in securing that result, and there's something to that, as even France has admitted. France had some maneuvers that were not successful, like a very short-lived attempt to turn Germany into a janissary. However, while France may not deserve as much credit for the solo as he would like, given that Italy is the one whose personal differences with Russia arguably resulted in the French solo, I think France deserves a lot of credit for playing a great game. Perhaps the strongest game. France got Germany to assist him in defeating England, and France got all of the gains from that conquest. France got Italy to agree to non-aggression with him, so Italy never successfully took a single French center at any point in the game. France used the dying powers of England and Austria to successfully stab Germany and break his power in a single year. France ultimately worked with Russia, resulting in Russia throwing the game to France in the end. If any single player in this game engaged in masterful manipulation, France is clearly the winner of that prize. Turkey and Italy did well in their efforts, but the results speak for themselves. At one point or another, almost every player danced on France's strings, and that's why he won. There were some tactical mistakes for sure, as there are in every game, and I hope that France, as much as anyone else, will study the moves here, because any mistakes he made were mistakes of pacing or tactics. But diplomacy is fundamentally not a war game. It's about manipulating people, and France did that better than anyone. That's why he won. I hope you liked this series of videos, and if so, I hope you'll like and subscribe and comment below Would love to hear your thoughts on what you'd like to see me do next. Until next time, Florida Man, out.